President Biden has commuted the sentences of 37 of the 40 inmates on federal death row. And I'm glad he did. The death penalty has a long history of racism, and a new report from the Death Penalty Information Center breaks down that history. Before the Civil War, from 1790 until 1860, the federal death penalty was used only for a small number of crimes like treason, piracy, and murder on federal property. After the Civil War, from 1862 to 1899, the federal death penalty became widely used to punish Native Americans resisting colonization. The largest mass execution in U.S. history took place when the federal government executed 38 members of the Dakota tribe the day after Christmas in 1862. There were also at least 7 mass executions that included black people during this time, with many taking place in front of large crowds. In fact, after the Civil War, the number of black people executed by the federal government increased 487%. Then, from 1900 to 1963, during the Jim Crow era, more than half of all federal executions were concentrated in Washington, D.C., where many black Americans fled during the Great Migration. 78 executions took place in the District of Columbia during this time, accounting for 53% of all federal executions in the country, and 76% of those executed were black men. Most death row inmates were convicted in state courts outside the president's jurisdiction, and one of the most notorious cases took place in 1944 when the state of Alabama wrongly executed a 14-year-old black boy named George Stinney Jr. after a one-day trial by an all-white jury that took less than 10 minutes to deliberate. Finally, in 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court outlawed capital punishment in the famous case of Furman v. Georgia. But 4 years later, in 1976, the High Court allowed the death penalty to resume. The Reagan 80s ushered in a new era of mass incarceration, and in 1987, a 5-4 majority of the U.S. Supreme Court dismissed the famous Balda study showing that black defendants who killed white victims were disproportionately targeted for the death penalty. In 1988, President Reagan signed a bill reinstating the federal death penalty, and in 1989, Donald Trump called for the death penalty for 5 black and brown teenagers wrongly accused in the Central Park jogger case in New York City. Between 1989 and today, 73% of all death penalty cases targeted people of color. But maybe the numbers are racially skewed because, black people commit more crime. Nope. First of all, we don't. But second, from 1988 to 1994, 75% of people convicted of participating in a drug enterprise under the Anti-Drug Abuse Act were white. But only 11% of white defendants were chosen for death penalty prosecutions. The other 89% were black or Hispanic. Even when we commit the same crimes, we're still far more likely to be overcharged and oversentenced. In 1994, President Clinton signed a bill expanding the death penalty. While the Clinton administration never used that power, the state governments did, and the number of state executions skyrocketed. As for federal executions, only 16 people have been executed in the modern era. 3 under George W. Bush, and 13 under Donald Trump, making him responsible for 81% of all modern federal executions. When President Biden came in office in 2021, the Justice Department issued a moratorium on the death penalty, but the federal death row remained racially skewed. Black people make up only 14% of the population, but accounted for 38% of the people on federal death row. Until today. Today's clemency announcement prevents Trump from executing dozens of federal death row inmates when he comes in office. The only 3 sentences Biden did not commute were for Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, Tree of Life synagogue shooter Robert Bowers, and Mother Emanuel AME church killer Dylan Roof, who killed 9 black church members in Charleston, South Carolina. I've been a lifelong opponent of capital punishment ever since I wrote an article in my hometown newspaper in Florida 43 years ago, arguing that the death penalty is racially discriminatory. More than 2,000 people remained on death row in state prisons, but only 4 states, Missouri, Oklahoma, Alabama, and Texas, accounted for 76% of all executions this year. What do they have in common? They're all places with a long history of enslaving and segregating black people.